longer to get to the microphone. I'm a social worker and have had great fun with that over the years, because those of you who know about my career know that I've focused on policing for the last 35 to 40 years. And it is always a great pleasure for me when I go and meet with police groups and I describe myself as a social worker, and I'm going to teach police about assertive police tactics, because the love relationship between police and social workers has never been particularly strong. I mentioned that I'm a social worker to maybe to soften the impression that I have gained over the years. At one point there was an article in the Los Angeles Times in which the ACLU agreed with me about something, and I framed it and have it up on my wall because the ACLU and I have not always seen eye-to-eye on issues. This is, in terms of, the question was asked, is Skid Row perhaps the largest concentration of the problem? And I have a lot of trouble using the term homeless, just because I think if you talk about the area of Skid Row and describe the problem as homeless there, I think that's a political statement, it's an ideological statement, and it doesn't get at the depth and the multiplicity of the problems that areas like Skid Row represent. But for those of you who are old enough to remember, there was another area that was very similar to Skid Row back in the 1980s, and we called it the New York City subway. And if you really wanted to show purgatory or hell on earth, a spooky place in which there was great danger, you would locate it in the New York City subway. And it was an environment that was completely out of control. And yet, if you went into to try and talk about that problem in New York City, everyone agreed that the problem was homelessness. The New York Times said it was homelessness. The police said it was homelessness. The transit authorities said it was homelessness. But if anyone would bother to go down into the subway and look, and just stand and pretend that you were a person from the movie and look at what was going on, this was the farthest thing from homelessness that one could imagine. I mean, people going over and under and around the turnstiles. People were circling the booths, waiting for the door to open so they could break into the booths. One person brought a rattlesnake and put a rattlesnake down and through the access to try and make sure, to try to get them to open the door. And later on, after he was arrested, he demanded his rattlesnake back. They had special high-speed fire extinguishers because people would come in with gasoline and try and pour gasoline into the booths to force people out. And that was described as homelessness. It wasn't homelessness, it was a culture of lawlessness. And I raise it because I think there's an important point to be made from it. By the way, I'm at the tail end of a cold, so I might not take my full 7 minutes and join in more giving questions and answers. Because I want to make the point of opportunity costs that my colleague and friend Mark Kleiman raised. Back in those bad old days, 89, 90, there were 4,000 police, transit police, dedicated to the transit, to the subway and to the transit authority. The environment was completely out of control. Bratton was brought in, implemented policies that were developed prior to his coming, and the subway came under control within a matter of months. And Malcolm Gladwell has written in his tipping point that a tipping point was reached. The interesting point now is the last figure that I heard for number of police in the New York City subway is under 2,000. There are 1,900 police at the last time I heard that figure. The subway is an orderly place. Ridership continues to increase, and the civility of the environment is impressive to anyone who uses the subway. And that is the idea of the additional 50 officers here was not that Bratton was particularly eager to allocate the 50 officers. When you allocate 50 officers in this city, you're cutting to the bone. The idea is to end the culture of lawlessness so we can go back to a level of policing that is appropriate for the area. This was an area that simply we lost control over the years for a variety of social politics, as a consequence of a variety of social politics. That area had to be brought under control. And we heard all kinds of testimony today. I mean, Heather made the point, and other people Heather made the point about control. Other people made the point about the resources that have to be invested and the approach that has to be taken to deal with the problems, the genuine problems of homelessness that are there. But my concern, my business, my preoccupation is how do you restore a sense of order so that those kinds of programs can have some impact. And you heard the testimony of people here who live in the area, how important that sense of order is to their personal development. And so what we're trying to do is to create a context into which rehabilitation can take place, housing can be sufficient, but basic to that is a sense of order, a sense that strangers can move through the community without being the victims of extortion. People can go for help without being peddled drugs, and that's what we've been trying to set up. Part of the problem, as far as I'm concerned, and I'm only semi-facetious about the ACLU and advocates, is that we're fighting the fights of the 1970s and the 1980s. And that is, what's going on in the Los Angeles Police Department now, and what went on during the 1980s. Because there was an attempt to deal with Skid Row in the 1980s, and it was based upon the idea of sweeps. Officers would come in, sweep the area. There were films that the chief showed at meetings at Harvard, Mark might remember this, that demonstrated very bad police action. And it was not defensible. But what's going on now in policing, in enlightened policing, we spent a lot of time training officers in New York City before we asked them to do what their basic job was. We spent a lot of time here, again, training these young officers. But they were also had available to them officers who had worked for a long time in Los Angeles, dealing with Skid Row in, I would say, informed and humanitarian ways. And I would just, I think I can't emphasize enough how important partners were to the police in New York City at that time, and I'm certain Gretchen will talk about that. But also here as well, because long before Bratton was in town, long before he invited me in to be of some assistance, there were commanders, there were captains like Charlie Beck, there were the business improvement districts who were struggling on a very lonely basis to try and get control over, that area. But it took that kind of upfront investment. My argument is that what you have to do in areas like Skid Row, like in the subway, in the early 1990s, is you have to make an upfront investment. Once you make that upfront investment, and of course at first you are going to see more arrests. The goal is not arrests. If arrests don't start to decline, you're not, in my judgment, you're not doing what Jim and I have recommended for a long time, and that is getting to that tipping point where you're getting control over the area. So I make then 2 points. The first point is you need an upfront investment in police to get control over an area when the culture of lawlessness is allowed to develop. And the second point is we have to scrutinize our police quite carefully. But at the same time as we scrutinize how the police perform in these areas, we shouldn't be fighting the fights of the 1970s and 80s. We shouldn't be fighting the fights of the abuse of the old vagrancy laws, the old panhandling laws. Police, I mean, one can argue, and it doesn't take much, that parents and grandparents of many of the African Americans in this room can recall the days when police, through the use of vagrancy laws, when police, through the use of disorderly conduct laws, kept African Americans in virtual slavery for half a century after slavery was ended. We have to remember that and be sensitive to that and continue to train people. But to say what's going on now in Los Angeles or New York City in terms of the reclaiming of public spaces is a continuation of those policies, those practices of pre-1970s, I think is a gross distortion of the kind of contributions that good policing operating on a community model can really do. So again, my points are